Right now, somewhere on Earth, a funeral is happening. A body is being lowered into the ground or placed on a pyre or sealed in a tomb. It's happening in a language you don't speak, in a religion you've never heard of, following rules that go back centuries. And yet every human culture that has ever been studied, every single one with no exceptions, does something deliberate with its dead. Bury them, burn them, wrap them, paint them, sing to them. That universal instinct had to start somewhere. There was a first body placed in the ground on purpose by hands that had never seen anyone do it before. And when you actually go looking for that moment in the archaeological record, the story you find is stranger, older, and a lot more contested than, and then humans started digging holes. It might not even have started with us. Current leading candidates for the oldest deliberate burials on Earth sit in a cluster of caves in modern-day Israel, Skul, Kafze, and a newly excavated site called Tinshemet, all roughly 100,000 years old. These aren't ambiguous scatter of bones situations. At Kafsa, archaeologists found the remains of at least 15 people, several of them children clustered near the cave entrance. One child was buried with a pair of deer antlers laid deliberately across the pelvis, antlers that serve no practical purpose whatsoever in a grave. Nearby, researchers recovered dozens of pieces of red ochre pigment, some of it apparently heat-treated to deepen the color, hinting at a deliberate aesthetic choice rather than an accident of geology. At school, a few miles away, one man was buried cradling the jawbone of a wild boar in his arms, one of the oldest known grave offerings ever discovered. And in 2025, the newly studied Shanidar Cave produced burials following the same patterns found at the other two sites, even though it sits roughly 60 miles away. That's not a coincidence. That's a shared tradition already established, already being passed down 100,000 years before anyone wrote anything down. Whoever these people were, they weren't improvising. They already had rules. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable for human exceptionalism. The first real argument over deliberate burial didn't even involve our species. In 1908, excavators at a site called La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France uncovered a Neanderthal skeleton curled into a fetal position, seemingly placed deliberately in a dug pit and covered over. The claim caused an uproar. At the time, Neanderthals were widely caricatured as little more than brutish, half-witted cavemen. The idea that they might have grieved, that they might have cared enough to bury one of their own, didn't fit the story anyone wanted to tell. Then came Shanidar Cave in the mountains of northern Iraq, where archaeologists eventually uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals. One of them, known as Shanidar I, had survived a withered arm, partial blindness, and severe injuries that would have made him essentially unable to fend for himself, meaning someone had almost certainly fed and protected him for years before he died. Another individual, Shanidar IV, became world famous in the 1960s under a much more poetic name. They called it the flower burial. The story was irresistible. Pollen clusters found in the soil directly beneath Shanidar IV were interpreted as the remains of an entire bouquet of wildflowers laid beneath the body before burial. For decades, this became the go-to image for Neanderthals weren't brutes, they were people who buried their dead with flowers. Then more recent analysis started picking the story apart. Researchers noticed the pollen wasn't scattered the way you'd expect, from loose flower stems crushed into a grave. It was clumped, in patterns that matched the nesting behavior of solitary bees that still live in that exact cave today. Other researchers pointed to a local burrowing rodent that hoards seeds and flowers underground in exactly the kinds of clusters that were found. The flowers most likely were never placed there by anyone at all. It would be easy to read that as the whole theory collapsing. But here's the twist within the twist. A fresh excavation at Shanidar between 2018 and 2022, 50 years after the original dig, uncovered an entirely new, still articulated Neanderthal skeleton lying right next to the famous flower burial spot in the same body position, facing the same direction, toward the cave entrance. That kind of repeated deliberate pattern is much harder to explain away than a single oddly placed body. The flowers were probably never real. The burial itself very likely still was. So if multiple species in multiple places independently started doing this, what actually triggered it? Researchers generally point to three competing explanations, and none of them have fully won the argument. The first is brutally practical. A decomposing body attracts flies, draws scavengers, and can spread disease through a small group living in close quarters. The simplest possible explanation is that burial started as basic pest and hygiene control, with the symbolism arriving later layered on top of something that began as housekeeping. The second is cognitive and symbolic. To bury someone, To deliberately position a body to add a possession that meant something to them requires treating that person as a unique, irreplaceable individual whose identity continues to matter after their body has stopped functioning. Some researchers argue this is one of the very first physical traces we have of abstract thought, the ability to hold an idea about someone who is no longer there. The third is the one most people have never heard, and it might be the strangest. A recent analysis of burials across the ancient Levant, the same region as Kavze School and Shanidar, noticed something odd. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens started burying their dead in the same area at roughly the same time, while they were actively competing over the same hunting grounds. Some archaeologists now argue that burial may have doubled as a kind of territorial marker, a physical generational claim that said in effect, "Our ancestors are buried here, this place belongs to us." Under this theory, the grave wasn't just a tribute to the dead, it was a deed to the land, written in bone. Hygiene, identity, or property. Maybe it was one. Maybe, like most things this old, it was a tangle of all three, and we're trying to force a single clean motive onto something that never had one. Strip away the specific theories, and something larger is sitting underneath all of this. For roughly 4 billion years, death on this planet looked the same. An organism stopped functioning, and the environment reclaimed it, exactly the way it reclaims a fallen leaf. Then at some point, maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe earlier, maybe more than once in more than one species, a creature looked at a body and didn't see a fallen leaf. It saw someone specific, someone who used to throw the spear a certain way, who used to sit in a certain spot by the fire, who left a hole in the group's shape that nothing else could fill. The grave is the oldest physical proof we have of that recognition, not the oldest tool, not the oldest fire. The oldest insistence that an individual had mattered. And the strange part is you've inherited that exact instinct fully intact 1,000 centuries later. You still mark the spot. You still keep the object that meant something. You still on some level refuse to let the person become just a body. That's not a modern invention. That's one of the oldest things we know about being human, and we may not even be the only ones who ever felt it. So next time you walk past a graveyard, you're not looking at a quiet patch of stone markers. You're looking at the longest running ritual our species, or maybe two of our species, has ever kept. What do you think actually started it? Hygiene, identity, or territory? Tell me in the comments. I want to see the arguments. And if this kind of deep history mystery is your thing, subscribe. There's a lot more buried in our past than people realize.